Selaco is a game I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. This first-person shooter developed by Altered Orbit Studios is easily my most anticipated game in recent memory. And now that it went into early access, with the release of its first out of 3 planned chapters, I'm finally allowed to share my thoughts on it. You see, full disclosure, I volunteered as a playtester for this game, which means I was under an NDA until the game's release. I also backed the game on Patreon. Both of these things I did because I played the demo and I saw, like many others, just how special this project is. In this video you will get my honest opinion on the game, but I just wanted to share these things for transparency's sake. With all the legal stuff out of the way, let's delve into the question, what is Selaco? Selaco is a single player FPS that just went into early access. Mind you, the early access label does not mean it's unfinished or unpolished in any way. For all intents and purposes, the first chapter is a lengthy, fully functional and carefully polished campaign. There are still 2 more chapters on the way before the game goes out of early access, but you might as well consider these free DLC. So that is why I'm prepared to make a bold statement based on my experience with the first chapter. Selaco is the best first-person shooter of the past decade. You have to understand that's a statement that carries a lot of weight to me. Even though I don't talk about them much here on this channel, I have a long track record with first-person shooters. My first gaming device I had access to as a kid was an, even by the standards of today, old-ass PC. So many of my first video games were the classic 90s shooters that my dad and my older brother introduced me to. My dad was always collecting treasure in Wolfenstein 3D, save scumming his way to the end of each level with the highest possible score. My brother was blasting monsters in Doom and later Quake, and then young me was blowing up aliens and supporting sex workers in Duke Nukem 3D. In short, glorious days. Since that time, I come back to the FPS genre every so often to see what's good. And when I came back a few years ago, I noticed something was different. The 90s style shooter I'd grown up with was making a comeback. In the wake of that modern classic, Doom 2016, indie games like Dusk and Medieval found an audience as they embraced the old school design and look of FPS games. A design philosophy that was phased out when the gaming industry took a drastic turn in the late 90s and early 2000s, with franchises like Half-Life, Halo and Call of Duty bringing a more cinematic, narrative-driven approach to the FPS genre. But from that moment a few years ago, I saw more and more shooters that seemed to willfully ignore most of the development and modernization, favoring the labyrinthian key hunts and over-the-top violence of the games that had started it all. These new shooters, inspired by ancient classics, would eventually be grouped under a new, tongue-in-cheek moniker, Boomer Shooter. I personally prefer the term Retro FPS or Indie FPS, which are the terms I will be using in this video, but the point remains that we saw a resurgence of a type of game that many, myself included, had presumed to have been lost to time. But here it is, making a comeback as its very own subgenre. It's within this subgenre that I found some of my favorite games of the past few years. There's f.e.a.r, a fast-paced shooter with a cyberpunk aesthetic that feels like the spiritual successor to 90s shooters like Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. It's even made on eDuke32, which is, simply put, a modernized version of the build engine, the technology that was powering Duke Nukem 3D all the way back in 1996. Both f.e.a.r itself and its expansion Aftershock featured authentic old-school gameplay held together by jaw-dropping level design and aesthetics. Then there is the early access title Supplies, an original IP that's being developed by veterans from the Doom modding community. Unsurprisingly, it runs on a modernized version of the old Doom engine, named GZ Doom. Gameplay-wise, it is still pretty close to the original Doom formula, just much faster, bloodier, and featuring its own world building and storytelling mechanics, which actually share more in common with Marathon, the game Bungie made before they went on to shock the world with Halo. Supplies is a game with an unmistakably classic look and feel, yet it's bustling with ambition even by the standards of today. As you may have noticed by now, I could talk about all of these games and the classics that inspired them for days. The point is, I absolutely love these games and I can wholeheartedly recommend them to anyone who is into this type of stuff. And yet Selaco? I feel like Selaco is different. As undying as my enthusiasm is for f.e.a.r, Supplies and other games like them, there's always a caveat. I love them, first of all because they're great games, but also because I grew up on the games that inspired these titles, and because I'm intricately familiar with the design of said classics. I'm even pretty familiar with what's going on under the hood. I'm no game developer and my technical knowledge is painfully limited, but I do have a rough idea of what the limitations are of the old Doom engine, or build, or the source ports that are being used to this day. So when I see games that have been created with engines that, while modernized, still have this ancient technology at their core, it takes me no effort to appreciate things in titles made with this tech that newer generations of gamers might just take for granted. A pool table made in GZ Doom is infinitely more impressive than a pool table in the Unreal Engine. But why would you give a crap if you, like most people, don't know or care what engine your game is running on, as long as it works? There's also the fact that some of the games I've mentioned so far stay pretty close to the source material. Again, that's not an issue, as these games don't exactly make a secret of their inspirations, quite the contrary. It also works perfectly for what they are trying to achieve. Deliver a faster, more polished, more ambitious take on the games we grew up with. In my opinion, they more than achieve those goals. However, the flip side is that these titles, great as they are, would be difficult to recommend to someone who has no knowledge of the games that inspired them. It would be like watching Breaking Bad, but skipping the first 2 seasons. It's still great, but you're missing out on a lot of the context required to fully appreciate what you're looking at. In short, the nostalgia factor of these retro-inspired shooters can feel like a barrier to entry if you want to fully enjoy them, which is not a problem by itself, but if this niche within the FPS genre wants to reach a wider audience, we need a game that bridges this gap. A game that can make your jaw drop even if you barely have any FPS experience under your belt. And that is where Selaco comes in. In this video I want to do 2 things. First, I simply want to talk about Selaco and all the things that make it good. Secondly, I want to give you a crash course in FPS history through the lens of Selaco. Not because you need that information to enjoy the game. You can pause this video right now, get the game and have a great time. But I want to delve into this because it is necessary to comprehend the scope and ambition of this project and to fully appreciate just how special the game Selaco is. And since I can't ask you to fight your way through 3 decades worth of essential first-person shooters, I'll bring you up to speed instead. So in this review, we'll look at the way that FPS design has evolved over the past 30 years, and which lessons Selaco has drawn from looking at the classics in the genre. Buckle up, because this is gonna be a lengthy ride. When you look at the history of Selaco, it doesn't necessarily stand out as being all that different from many of the other indie FPS games out there. Its origin is in fact quite similar to its aforementioned colleague Supplies. Selaco was initially conceived as a total conversion mod for Doom, but the scope and ambition of the project began to outgrow the confines of mod status, and so it grew into its own standalone IP to be distributed commercially. Over the years, Selaco has been developed by a small indie dev team gathered under the name Altered Orbit Studios. And while Selaco indeed became its own thing, there was one characteristic in particular that it retained from the modding days: its engine. To this day, GZ Doom, that modernized Doom engine I mentioned earlier, is what powers everything you see in Selaco. It is tempting to think this was a conscious choice to retain a degree of authenticity or a retro feel within the game, but going by the developer's own statements on the matter, it was more of an organic practical choice. They had been working with the engine already, and they reckoned it's a great tool to work with, despite it at times being, and I quote, a massive pain. To the eyes of the layman, which by the way includes myself, this seems baffling at first. When you play the game, it plays, looks and feels nothing like Doom or any archaic shooter from that era. Informed by the great shooters that came before it, sure, but never to that same degree of familiarity that condemned the likes of f.e.a.r to a dedicated but relatively small band of admirers. And sure, younger, less experienced gamers probably won't appreciate or care about this achievement, but that doesn't matter. Had Selaco been made on Unity or Unreal Engine, it would still be, at its core, one of the most well-crafted games in recent memory. Trying to structure all of the information about Selaco is difficult because there are just so many places to start. So let's take a step back and cover the basic premise of the game. You play as Don Collins, an ace security captain who wakes up in the hospital amid an alien invasion. The year is 2255 and you are on Selaco, a space station that became humanity's new home after the Earth was destroyed. Something that becomes immediately clear about Selaco as a setting is that the settlers have tried their best to mimic life on Earth. The hospital you wake up in looks like an actual hospital, albeit a century or two into the future. Later locations also reflect this approximation of reality. After you leave the hospital, you explore the surrounding structures, including a parking garage, shops, bars, a spa, a library, outdoor urban areas, you name it. A particular highlight is the 5th level, which takes place inside a life-sized mall and lets you explore all the locations you would, and sometimes wouldn't, expect there, like a bank, an arcade with playable games, a toy store, a plant store, fast food joints. You get the idea. Now, while exploring these areas for yourself will be a joy no matter your previous experience with FPS games, there is a bit of nostalgic significance to these locales. You see, the earliest FPS games, more specifically Wolfenstein 3D and the first 2 Doom games, had levels that didn't really look like anything you'd encounter in the real world. It's pretty easy to see when you look at Wolfenstein 3D, as the game's levels are just endless corridors with their only distinguishing features being symbology that would get this video delisted in Germany. Doom was a major upgrade from Wolfenstein 3D, but the architecture in that game was still abstract in the sense that it was obvious it was designed with the sole purpose of facilitating interesting gameplay. But then came the games made with the more advanced build engine created by Ken Silverman. The classic build engine games you should know are Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior and Blood. In addition to looking more graphically impressive for their day, the environments also stood out because they were often mimicking real-world places. For example, Duke 3D's first chapter starts in a CD cinema, then takes you to a video store, a strip club, a prison, and even inside a submarine. Shadow Warrior starts in a Chinese restaurant, and Blood's first level fittingly features a funeral home. Okay, sure, these might not be much to look at these days, but I can't understate how rare it once was for PC games to feature levels that, actually look like things. It lent a sense of familiarity to these games that I think people inherently crave. It's no coincidence that the first things modders would make when creating custom levels for Doom, Duke 3D or Half-Life were additions of their own homes or other everyday places. Yet the way in which build engine games depicted such places never seemed fully realistic, even at the time. They always appeared like a rough approximation of reality. Cartoon realism, if you will. Whether it's coincidental or not, this pseudo-realism is what's reflected in Selaco's environments. The places look real, like places you would find on, planet Earth, but once in a while we are reminded that they are not. The best example is a section early in the game when you first explore the streets of Selaco, and suddenly there is a power outage. No electricity, no light. And so it is revealed that what seemed like natural moonlight and a real skyline are actually just artificial projections put in place to try and make the space station look like Earth. This adds a super creative twist to the entire game environment, as everything around us appears to be a mere imitation of what humanity had grown used to on their forlorn home planet. The result is a sort of desolate, ominous atmosphere that manifests in every out corner of Selaco. Many of the locales you visit should be full of life and joy, but are instead empty, abandoned, and sometimes even destroyed. And the deeper you delve into the world of Selaco, the more sinister things get. Selaco offers a game world that feels like it's been lived in, but is not anymore. It takes that sense of familiarity, first provided by the build engine games of old, and uses it to create one of the most convincing, immersive game worlds ever seen in a first-person shooter. A sentiment that is present in all generations of gaming is that a great setting is worth little if it doesn't also host great gameplay. The thing that impresses me the most about Selaco is that both the gameplay and the game world are so thoroughly thought out. There is an incredible depth to Selaco, one that reveals itself most noticeably through the combat. Oh, the combat. Let's start with the arsenal. The weapons in this game are designed so well. They all have detailed sprites, although the fluidity of the animations often makes it seem like they are fully rendered 3D models. There's the pistol, which is actually hard as fuck and a great help for taking out distant enemies early in the game. Then there's the assault rifle, a submachine gun, a shotgun and a sniper rifle. These are staple in any FPS, but I would put each and every one of them at or near the top of the list of their respective categories when comparing them to their counterparts in other games. Then there are the more specialized weapons, such as the nail gun, a grenade launcher with 3 different ammo types, and probably my favorite weapon of them all, the plasma rifle. Look at it as a souped-up assault rifle that fires lethal AoE damage at the enemy. Every weapon has a bunch of unlockable upgrades and alt fires. Upgrades can be purchased in designated save rooms, whereas alt fires can be found in some of the game's many secrets. You keep these alt fires in subsequent playthroughs and they can be very helpful. Examples would be a shotgun alt fire that makes you fire 2 shells at once, making this weapon even more ridiculously powerful. Or a little auto fire turret that you can launch from your nail gun, which locks onto any enemy unfortunate enough to stand in its path. But perhaps my favorite part of the weapons is their sound. Just listen, these ain't no pea shooters, friend. Every weapon in Selaco has gone through rigorous balance changes during the development process, with the end result being that each weapon has its place in your inventory. The exact role of a weapon in your armory can change a bit depending on how you choose to upgrade it. In my playthrough I used the assault rifle as my bread and butter weapon, giving it a bigger magazine and tighter aim to increase its performance. The shotgun with a damage upgrade was for dominating close encounters in room-to-room combat. The nail gun I used to clear out big rooms full of enemies, while I used its auto turret alt fire alongside landmines to booby trap rooms. I used the submachine gun and its EMP stun alt fire for crowd control against smaller enemies, and I switched to the dual wield alt fire when I knew I'd face large amounts of lower tier enemies. And then the plasma rifle and grenade launcher were for quickly turning the tide in the game's most challenging scenarios. I approach every fight like a puzzle, where a large part of my success would depend on selecting the right tools for the job ahead and keeping track of different enemies as I'd switch between weapons to best deal with each of them. This is necessary too, because firefights in Selaco are nothing short of thrilling all of the time. The enemy combat AI in Selaco is damn smart. They will push you when you're reloading, flush you out with a grenade if you're camping, flank and surround you, and play more defensively when they're alone and wounded. The entire experience is elevated by enemy squad members communicating with each other. Not only does this enhance the illusion of genuine intelligence and cooperation, but it also balances out the gameplay. Enemies in Selaco are brutal. Even on the lower difficulties, you are always 1 or 2 bad decisions away from death. Communication between the soldiers gives you an insight into what they are planning to do, where they are, and even how many of them are left. This allows you to anticipate their moves before they happen, creating a much fairer challenge. When you die, it is often because you failed to react to a vital bit of information. You left your flank open or you fixated too much on one target. Death in Selaco is harsh, but it's seldom cheap. What makes it even better is that nearly every object in the game will react to being shot. Shoot a fire extinguisher, you're gonna see its contents spray everywhere, obscuring your view. Shoot a bucket of paint, paint everywhere. Shoot a sack of flour, flour everywhere. Even items that do not have a particular animation or effect associated with them will still produce a bunch of dust and smoke when shot at. And of course the enemies will react in numerous different ways depending on where and how they are shot. You can blow their heads off, pin them to a wall with a nail gun, or blow them into a pink mist with your shotgun. You can even blow their legs off and watch them crawl away in desperation before they bleed out. Or set them on fire with a propane tank and watch them scream in terror as they burn to death, just like in Blood. It's like you are the protagonist in a super violent, over-the-top action movie. An area will look completely different if combat has taken place in it. One of the most enjoyable parts of all of this is just looking at the result of your carnage once the last enemy has been taken out. There's just an immense satisfaction you get from walking through a place that's been completely blasted to shit and you're the one responsible. It even helps with navigation, as it's pretty easy to tell where you've already been just by looking at all the chaos. I often found myself reloading combat scenarios again and again, Not just because I was getting my ass handed to me by the aggressive AI, but also because the dynamic nature of the combat made it so that each fight felt unique. As a player, you are pushed to experiment, to try different tactics and to use the environment to your advantage. The silly crap I ended up doing while playtesting this game at one point made me worried the devs might think I wasn't taking the whole thing seriously. But the truth is, I just had too much fun pushing the game to its limits and trying to see what was possible. Most of this is facilitated by the way the combat AI is programmed and how the environmental design caters to its strengths. Now, to those of you who have some old school FPS experience under their belt, all of this might sound awfully familiar. That is because this entire combat system is very reminiscent of the 2005 game f.e.a.r. f.e.a.r, in my opinion still one of the greatest games ever created, was an action-packed horror FPS that is now primarily remembered for its AI. Basically all of what I said just now about Selaco's combat is also true of f.e.a.r's combat. And it's not like the devs tried to hide this either. f.e.a.r is often mentioned as a major source of inspiration in the game's marketing, and many things, from the way the soldiers look and sound, right down to the layout of some of the combat arenas, is unapologetic f.e.a.r worship. You can even find a bunch of Easter eggs referring to the game. Hell, they even went as far as to lift the Penetrator, f.e.a.r's iconic nail gun, speed up its rate of fire by about 1 million, and put it in Selaco. These references are immediately apparent to anyone who's played f.e.a.r. But, and this is extremely important, you don't need to have played f.e.a.r to enjoy Selaco's combat in full. It's not just there as a homage to a great game, but also because f.e.a.r's combat was amazing and it's every bit as amazing in Selaco. Perhaps it's even better. As much as Selaco draws from f.e.a.r, it would be a mistake to call it a f.e.a.r clone or even a spiritual successor to f.e.a.r. What Selaco does is much more than that. It's like the Selaco devs studied every classic FPS out there, took notes on what made each one of them good, and extracted exactly those elements to put into their own game. And then they added a ton of original ideas and modern design tweaks to make for an experience that feels familiar but unique at the same time. That's why Selaco's status as a f.e.a.r clone, or replica if you will, doesn't really hold up. Back in the day, one of the defining features and often complaints about f.e.a.r was that, much like the earliest FPS games, each area was designed to accommodate gameplay rather than to evoke believability. As a result, the settings themselves were all rather generic, with most of them being some variation of office building or industrial site, featuring tons of pointless corridors and doorways. While this approach inspired excellent combat encounters, it didn't make for a memorable or even very believable world. The world felt like it just existed for you to fight in. Selaco is quite different in this regard. The verisimilitude of the world is a core element of the game. Every place you visit feels like it was there before you arrived to the scene. Once full of life, now desolate but still recognizable as something built by humans. It's that same cartoon realism that made me love build engine games back in the day. Yet somehow Selaco also features plenty of smartly designed combat arenas that facilitate the gameplay in the same way that f.e.a.r once did. Only the Selaco devs and especially their art department have been much more creative about dressing up these combat arenas as places that feel like they have a primary functional purpose that is not just being an area to kill bad guys in. I'll delve into this a bit more later. Look, my knowledge of game design jargon is perhaps too limited to say this poignantly, but I just cannot stress enough how impressive it is for a game to marry such smart design with a believable game world. I can think of few other games in any genre that do this so well. While there are many games that Selaco draws inspiration from, none of these inspirations feel gratuitous. They all serve a greater purpose, to make you, the player, have fun. One major pet peeve I have is when bad design in retro-inspired games is excused with "that's just how games used to play back in the 90s. A recent example would be how in Phantom Fury, when you find a secret, it does not give you any message or confirmation. They probably copied this from Half-Life, the game's main source of inspiration, but that still doesn't make it a good design choice in 2024. The people demand a dopamine rush, damn it. A more grave example would be games that have confusing and obnoxious level design, where the excuse is, but you used to get lost in games all the time. Even if that were true, it is still annoying to have a game where the flow is interrupted every 5 to 10 minutes because you don't know where the hell to go, and the game is not doing a great job at telling you. Most shooters, even back in the day, actually did have a map and decent signposting. There are some exceptions of old games that actually were held to navigate through, like Hexen, but that game is notorious for a reason, and I'd wager there aren't too many people who'd want to see exactly that aspect of the game make a glorious comeback. My point is that any developer can take inspiration from a game and try to mimic some of its design. But to do so successfully, you need a thorough understanding of not only what made those old games so popular, but what held them back. You then need to take all of this knowledge and implement into your game only those things that you think your audience would enjoy, and not shy away from modernizing some of these old systems 20 or 30 years down the line. And this is exactly what Selaco does all the time. It looked at f.e.a.r. and took some key elements from its combat, but did away with those aspects of the gameplay that did not age as gracefully. No matter where you look, the primary question that Selaco devs always seem to have asked is not what would John Romero do, but is it fun? And or does it make the game better? Let's take the health system as an example. In FPS games there are two primary ways to handle player health. You get shot at, you lose health. How do you get it back? If you have only played more modern FPS games, you're probably the most familiar with the regenerating health system, like in Call of Duty. If you take too much damage, which you can usually notice by the amount of raspberry jam on your screen, you have to take cover, wait for your health to go back to normal, while praying a grenade isn't thrown your way, and then you can resume the fight. Some games have a variation of this system, such as in Halo, where you have a number of shields to protect you before your health starts to drop, but the principle behind the system is pretty much the same otherwise. Before regenerating health became the norm, FPS games mainly worked with a health pickup system. The simplest version of this can be found in the really old school shooters such as Wolfenstein 3D, Rise of the Triad and the first Doom, where the only way to get back health was to pick up health items, presented in the form of food or medkits. These could be found in fixed locations in each level. Subsequent games then started to expand on the system a bit. Doom had already added an armor system for damage mitigation, as well as a power-up to overcharge your health to double its standard value. Marathon had interactive stations where you could recharge your health and shields, and in addition to the standard instant health pickups, games like Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior and Blood had a separate portable medkit. You could pick one of these up even when you were at full health and activate it at any point when you needed healing. By the time f.e.a.r. came around, in 2005, regenerating health was quickly becoming the genre's standard. However, f.e.a.r. had its own system, more in line with old school design, but still different, where it would only give you portable medkits, of which you could carry up to 10 at a time. You could then use them at your own discretion whenever you needed them, creating a system where you could hoard a bunch of health pickups to save for difficult encounters. The game would also let you regenerate a small portion of your health back if you got really low, in order to at least give you a fighting chance. Before we move on to Selaco's health system and the relevance of all this information to that game, allow me to explain that the industry's change in approach to health systems has deeply impacted the way in which FPS games are designed. When we look at the classic system of non-regenerating health, this meant that developers had to make sure that every section of every level contained enough health pickups to allow the player to progress from fight to fight. These games often had hit scan enemies, which made it really difficult for most players to not take at least some damage. So, say if you have made it out of a tough fight with just 15% health left, the game has to give you a chance to recuperate, lest your next fight be impossible to win. In a lot of games, this led to a natural sort of pacing, where difficult fights were interspersed with moments of relative quiet to allow you to buff up for the next big confrontation. This is even visible in a late classic like f.e.a.r, where the horror segments were not just there for atmosphere and narrative exposition, but also to allow the player to recover from combat. So in short, if you use an old school health system based on pickups, this forces you to put a lot of thought into pacing. In order to maintain the balance of the game, you had to think about enemy placement, item placement, and in some cases even about alternative ways to give the player an edge in a difficult situation. Sure, there were still developers that used this to be cruel to the player, especially on higher difficulty settings, but the point is that they've at least thought about it and consciously chose the conditions that they deemed to render an enemy encounter winnable. All of this changed significantly with regenerating health. If the health of a player is continuously regenerating, you don't have to worry about them being too weak to win the next encounter. So as long as you allow the player to obtain enough ammo, which you can simply do by making it drop from dead enemies, you as a developer are not incentivized to pull any punches. You can just throw all of the enemies at the player all of the time because they only need to hide behind cover for 10 seconds to get back to full health, and they're back in action. In fact, you might even be actively encouraged to keep the enemies flowing in if you want to provide any sort of challenge to the player. This leads to a whole different approach to encounter design. If you take any Call of Duty campaign, nearly every fight is like doing whack-a-mole with a rifle. You are just killing dozens of enemies that keep popping out of cover until you progress far enough in the area to trigger the next sequence, which will probably play out in the exact same fashion. Other games take what I like to call the clown closet approach to enemy encounters, where they just keep spawning waves of enemies into the same combat arena. Mind you, I'm not saying that regenerating health in FPS games is bad, nor that games that have it are poorly designed, but the popularity of this system did have a significant impact on the way these games are paced and balanced. And I do think it became easier for developers to put less thought into these aspects of their game and rely too heavily on a high volume of enemy encounters to add challenge to the game, often to the point of tedium. So how does Selaco tackle the issue of player health? As a game that runs on GZ Doom, it would have been easy for the developers to just take the classic system of health and armor pickups only, and it does have those. On the surface, there are various types of health pickups and various types of armor, just like in classic Doom, but there's more to it. Selaco also takes from the f.e.a.r system of being able to carry multiple portable medkits up to a maximum of 3. This gives the player a bit more freedom to play aggressively, but it doesn't allow them to completely trivialize some encounters by just popping 7 or 8 medkits in a row, as was possible to do in f.e.a.r. Selaco also has a f.e.a.r-like system of limited regeneration, whereby your health will go back up to 35 whenever it gets below that number, giving you at least a fighting chance in every encounter. If you run out of medkits and can't find any in the world, you can buy them at one of the many Gwyn stations. Sassy machines that do not only sell medkits, but also allow you to overcharge your health against a small fee. There is even a mercy system also inspired by f.e.a.r, where if the player takes up to a certain amount of damage that would normally have killed them, their HP gets stuck at one point for a moment, granting them a second chance. This mercy system is not even communicated to the player, and it's merely there to allow for these clutch moments where you survive a super tough situation that should have killed you. Why do I go into such great detail about the health system of Selaco? Because it exemplifies what the game stands for. Every single system or mechanism in its game has been thoroughly thought out in order to provide the player with the maximum amount of enjoyment, while also maintaining the pace and balance of the whole experience. In taking inspiration from other classic games, Selaco keeps the good, but vitally it also does away with the bad. There's no "this annoying feature is in the game because old games had it too," it's either good or it isn't. And that is exactly the approach that's needed for this bustling subgenre of retro-inspired FPS games to burst out of its bubble and reach a wider audience. Selaco's theme of taking the right dosage of inspiration from old-school FPS design carries on into the way its levels are structured. To better understand what this entails, we'll need to explore the way level design in FPS games has evolved over the years. A word often used to describe level design of old games like Wolfenstein, Doom and Blood is one I've also mentioned in my introduction, labyrinthian. You see, the levels in those games were linear in the sense that there was a starting point, a finish line, and a series of tasks you had to perform in order to get there. But as you were carrying out those tasks, you were free to roam and explore within the confines of the levels, which typically contain tons of secret areas for the player to discover. You'd often be rewarded for going off the beaten path. Some of those games featured levels where you'd have multiple entry points, meaning multiple different ways of engaging with your enemies and achieving your objectives. Such levels felt like little self-contained sandboxes that gave the player a sense of freedom that was rare in gaming in those days. And the more complex the level design, the easier it was to get lost. This produced a sort of maze-like semi-linearity. In old FPS games, you had to overcome not just your enemy, but the level itself. In the second half of the 90s, things started to change. Well-known FPS games like Star Wars Dark Forces from 1995 and GoldenEye from 1997 already featured specific objectives you had to complete, as opposed to the classic Doom formula where you merely had to gather keys in order to reach the end of each level. But things truly started to change when Half-Life came out in 1998. In Half-Life, rather than going from level to level, you played through the entire game in one smooth sequence. This was a huge step for not just first-person shooters, but gaming as a whole, as Half-Life was one of the first big games to successfully deliver a more cinematic experience. Its impact was so great that the very day that Half-Life was released, any FPS that came before it immediately seemed outdated. If you wanted to be successful as a shooter post-1998, you had to follow the Half-Life formula at least to some degree. This is why many people, myself included, consider 1998 to be the end of the classic FPS era. I have to emphasize that this new cinematic approach changed everything. It did a lot of good as it helped make the FPS genre more mature and immersive. Shooters were no longer about mindless slaughter, you were part of a living, breathing world. But in order to make such a world work, you had to make certain compromises. If you wanted to deliver a cinematic experience, you couldn't just let the player wander off into hundreds of little corridors and potentially disrupt the flow of the story or miss out on a bombastic set piece that took months of development time to set up. As such, many of the games that followed in the next decade started to feel more and more linear and restrictive to those with the impulse to explore. This became doubly true with the advent of the military shooter. In 1999, Medal of Honor combined a cinematic approach with a World War II setting to much critical acclaim. Medal of Honor Allied Assault from 2002 was an even bigger success, but some of that game's developers went on to create a direct competitor that you might be more familiar with. Its name? Call of Duty. Call of Duty as a series is important because it represents the logical conclusion of the cinematic approach to game design and the restrictions it imposes on the player. You see kids, there was a time when Call of Duty single player campaigns mattered. The original Modern Warfare from 2002 was wildly successful, and its campaign in a way still serves as the blueprint for the modern single player FPS. The game had a relatively short campaign that took you from set piece to set piece with, for the time, mind-blowing production values. The core combat loop was of secondary importance to the cinematic aspect of the game. Every fight was just a path to the next cutscene or set piece. Funnily enough, in those days this was perceived by audiences as modern and complex design, whereas the old school design of games in the early to mid 90s was seen as simplistic. But when you look back at a game like Modern Warfare nowadays, it is pretty easy to see the seams of its design. Don't get me wrong, the game was great at what it set out to do, but the level design itself is incredibly simplistic. By comparison, the level design of an older game like Blood was much more complex. It's just the way in which these levels are dressed up that makes it seem like it's the other way around. In Blood, you were just hunting for keys to open up new parts of the level, whereas in Call of Duty you were completing objectives like blowing up tanks, taking out snipers, or freeing hostages. These may feel distinct in a way that one seems much more immersive than the other, but functionally they're not all that different. You are just checking a box in order to progress the level. And when you compare the levels themselves, the labyrinthian design of old gives a lot of agency to the players that was lost in the archetypical cinematic FPS. In Blood, you often had multiple ways to progress through a level or to enter a building. You were more free to backtrack or venture off the beaten path, whereas in a game like Modern Warfare, you had to go through a very specific set of sequences in order to be successful. If you were able to flank the enemy, it was because the developers set out one clear path for you to do so. It was clearly by design. Finding a path around the enemy didn't make you feel smart or accomplished, and if you did try to genuinely outsmart the enemy, more often than not you'd be stopped in your tracks by a locked door or an insurmountable wall. One thing that is undeniable is that this new generation of FPS games had much more advanced AI. Enemies were able to react to what you were doing and had advanced pathfinding to ambush you or protect themselves. In older games, enemies kinda just walked towards you or stood still as they shot at you. Once again, it's how these encounters appear at first that makes one seem far more complex than the other. But is it? Even when fighting against dumb enemies, you can add a lot of depth to the encounter design. One key aspect of old school shooters is that you had a large arsenal of weapons at your disposal, often 10 or even more. These weapons all came with their own strengths and drawbacks. The most straightforward example is Doom, which is the game that came up with this entire system. You had a shotgun for destroying enemies at close range, a chain gun to quickly clear rooms, a rocket launcher as a ranged equivalent of a shotgun, a plasma gun as a stronger version of a chain gun, and a BFG to nuke an entire room. If you wanted to be successful, you had to use the right weapon against the right kind of enemy, to ensure that you'd quickly get rid of threats, while also not wasting too much precious ammo on low tier enemies. This helped define the core combat loop of the old school shooter. As FPS YouTuber f.e.a.r once pointed out, contrary to popular belief, these games were not about memorizing enemy spawn locations, but rather about the ability to swap weapons constantly. This is the concept that drove a game like Duke Nukem 3D as much as it does the more recent Doom Eternal. When we go back to Modern Warfare, it had a typical modern weapon system of the day, where you were only able to carry 2 weapons at the same time and a handful of grenades. You still had to bring the right tool for the job. For example, snipers are best countered with a sniper rifle of your own, but there was much less emphasis on weapon swapping. Games like that also tended to give you the right weapons for the job in a moment itself, so as a player you barely had to think about weapon choice. Instead, the core combat loop was exactly what I described earlier: whack-a-mole with a gun. Get behind cover, pop out of cover, shoot 1 or 2 enemies who have also popped out from behind their cover, get back to cover, regenerate your health and go again. You can repeat this until you've whacked enough moles to progress to the next area. What's important to take away from all of this is that the modernization of FPS games added a lot of complexity to the presentation of said games, but the same was not always true for the intricacy of the gameplay itself. In these shooters becoming more mature, cinematic and visually impressive, some of that X factor was left behind. It's one of the main reasons why there is a resurgence of more retro-inspired shooters that turn back time and ignore the modernization of the genre. Selaco is once again different. The shooter is decidedly retro in its presentation and parts of its gameplay, what with every weapon in your arsenal having its own role, but at the same time it doesn't ignore the existence of games developed after the 90s. As with the health system we've already discussed, the developers have looked for inspiration from various sources for their level design, and picked those elements that work within their game to achieve maximum player enjoyment. At first glance, the levels in Selaco have a retro feel to them. You collect keycards to open up different parts of the level, and occasionally have to loop back to parts you've already visited, reflecting that classic labyrinthian design of the 90s. But there's so much more to it. The levels are presented as one uninterrupted sequence. There are end of level screens, but the starting point of each new level is where you ended the previous one. This idea is in line with Half-Life, which unsurprisingly is touted as one of the game's main sources of inspiration, allowing Selaco to tell its story in a cinematic way without taking control away from the player. Key hunting is also just a part of making your way through each level. The game does also have fleshed out objectives that help drive forth the story and give you the idea that you're actually working towards a goal. You can also travel between different levels either just by physically backtracking or by using the subway system that becomes available early in the game. It's not quite Metroidvania-like, as backtracking is mostly just made possible to gather secrets you missed out on, rather than an essential part of finishing the game. But it still imposes this idea of a big, sprawling, semi-open world that you are free to move around in. Don't get me wrong, this is not a sandbox shooter like the Far Cry series where you can move in any direction and find a side mission of sorts. As you play through Selaco, there is still a tangible sense of linearity to the levels, as you do have to complete specific tasks in order to progress to the next part. The pacing of these sequences is amazing, as the game wisely resists the urge that many quote-unquote boomer shooters have of just throwing endless waves of enemies at you. After each encounter you are given enough breathing space to recover and explore, which you will want to do because there are secrets absolutely everywhere. Some of these secrets are straightforward, like getting onto a ledge and collecting some cash, while others are more complex. There's a secret early in the game where you have to deliver a koala plushie from one part of the level all the way to the last room, where you can exchange said Antipodian companion for a valuable weapons upgrade. My absolute favorite secret was in level 5. I had entered a cinema where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I recalled the most memorable cinema in FPS history, the one in the first level in Duke Nukem 3D. In that sequence, if you blew up part of the movie screen with a rocket or a grenade, you'd reveal a secret area with a jetpack and some ammo. So, driven by pure instinct, I fired a grenade at the cinema screen in Selaco, and I found an identical looking secret area with a plasma rifle. It was so cool seeing that little treat for people who had experience with those old games. Experience, however, that again is by no means a requirement to enjoy the game. Because that's the brilliant thing of all of this. You can find so many of the best elements of FPS level design anywhere in Selaco, all combined into one seamless whole that leaves out all the negatives. It delivers the labyrinthian design of old school shooters, but with good signposting and a map to prevent you from getting lost or confused. It also gives us the cinematic experience of Half-Life, yet while retaining a large degree of freedom and maneuverability. Still, the most impressive part of the level design remains the layout of the combat arenas. Much like in f.e.a.r, each fight takes place in an area that is specifically designed to facilitate combat. You can compare this to multiplayer deathmatch map design, where each room needs to have enough flanking possibilities, circular navigability, and no places where the player can just easily camp without any drawbacks. This leads to dynamic combat, where you are constantly playing cat and mouse games with your enemies, trying to take them out one by one before you get flanked, and sometimes even setting traps you then try to lure them into. What Selaco does straight up better than f.e.a.r is making all of these arenas look like actual functional places. f.e.a.r's levels also had a realistic look to them, but the combat arenas retained a degree of abstraction that was clearly just there because it made for better combat. Selaco still has this, but as said, the designers did a much more thorough job at making these arenas seem like actual places that would be fully functional and maneuverable under normal circumstances. You could put many of these locations in a story-based RPG and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The key to this approach is a number of clever level layouts that, for example, use separate office spaces to create flanking opportunities. These spaces are then filled with a ton of clutter, most of which you can interact with to a mind-boggling degree. Just take that ceiling fan. It is not just there for decoration. If you walk into it, it will actually stop spinning until you move away. And if you shoot it while an enemy is standing beneath it, well, rip to them. Want to send a nasty message to your enemy? Just grab a paintbrush and start expressing yourself. Can't be bothered wasting bullets? Let a propane tank do the work for you. I could go on for ages and not even scratch the surface. The amount of work that went into this is absolutely insane, and I mean that in the most literal sense. But the result is nothing to joke about. It's a living, breathing world that responds to the player's every action and is tailored to host some of the best FPS combat seen in recent memory. What you should take away from all this is that Selaco broke the mold with these levels. The level designers have resurfaced the underrated complexity and maneuverability of old school games, while somehow retaining the cinematic flow of more modern titles. They have taken and improved the interactive cartoon realism of old build engine games and used it to create an addictive combat loop, the likes of which we have seldom seen since the first f.e.a.r game. It's like the devs were aware of everything that made different FPS games good and managed to put it all into one formula without any of it seeming disjointed or out of place. I don't know if they give out honorary doctorates for FPS design, but just give one to the Selaco team already. You know what's better than a great level? A great level that sounds the part. As far as FPS games go, that used to be pretty easy to achieve. Just make your guns sound punchy and hire someone to write you a killer soundtrack. If your protagonist has a voice, you make them say a bunch of pop culture references and other quips and you're good to go. But as games became more cinematic, so did the demand for more fleshed out sound design. After all, what would the Saving Private Ryan D-Day scene be without all those bullets whizzing through the water, the explosions, the agonizing screams of soldiers? If video games wanted to claim to be cinematic, In other words, like blockbuster movies, they had to up their game. Going back to our old friend Modern Warfare, you can't deny that it still sounds damn amazing even to this day. When indie FPS games went retro, they mostly reverted to the old formula. Punchy gun sounds, killer soundtracks, snazzy one-liners. Decidedly old-school games like I Am Fury, Supplies at Dusk do exactly this. And it clearly works for the type of game they are aiming to be. However, Selaco, by being more cinematic in its design and presentation, couldn't really get away with doing this. The game does not have the fast pace of the aforementioned releases, and it would feel out of place to have a lavish prog rock or synthwave soundtrack pumping at max volume. There is plenty of music in the game, good music at that, but it's used pretty sparingly across the campaign. You often hear it during climatic action sequences as if the game's really communicating to you that shit's about to go down. My personal favorites include the water hazard music you hear in level 2, the track that plays during the escape sequence at the end of level 6, and the ambient tracks that can be heard in the bonus level Starlight. That's not to say there's nothing to listen to when the music falls silent. In fact, one of the reasons why music is used so sparingly is that it allows for Selaco's sound design to shine. In the world of Selaco, everything makes noise. Whether it's the droning of underground pipes, the clankering of machinery, alarms going off, steam being blown into a room, water flowing, everything is buzzing and humming in accordance with the type of environment you find yourself in. From the frantic noise in the hospital to the suspenseful ambient in the underground facility, the sound is essential for communicating atmosphere to the player. On top of that, the sound design is also important for the gameplay proper. As is customary in old school shooters, different enemy types make different noises, giving you a bit more material to work with when you're trying to anticipate and avoid the next attack. Sound can also enhance the experience. We saw earlier how shooting different objects can cause all kinds of mayhem visually, but the same goes for the audio. Shooting a perfume bottle does not sound the same as shooting a chair. This adds yet another dimension to the game's immersion and interactivity. One that, once again, sets it apart from more traditional indie FPS games. The way the sound influenced my mood while playing this game reminded me of yet another one of Selaco's influences, Doom 3. Doom 3 was always a dark horse in the franchise, as it was a slow-paced horror game that shared little in common with the entries in the series that came before or since. But it had some pretty cool ideas, some of which you can find in Selaco. These include the storytelling through datapads, interactive keypads, but also the atmospheric sound design. This influence becomes really apparent in level 6, where the slow burn of uncovering one of Selaco's darkest secrets reminded me a lot of the opening stages of Doom 3. A big part of that was the way the levels sounded when I was alone. It was just eerie, almost scary. This was an emotion I didn't expect to feel in this type of game, but they nailed it. With big thanks to the way all of this not only looked but sounded. Would Selaco still have been a great game without this amount of detail in its sound design? It certainly would have, but it's the devs going above and beyond in every department, including sound, that just elevates the entire experience to a level where it becomes increasingly difficult to find genuine jarring flaws with it. Having lurked on Selaco's Steam forums for a good few months, one of the most common suggestions for the game seemed to be to replace gunslinger Don Collins with a male protagonist. When the gender of your protagonist is the most common critique leveled at your game, this means two things. 1. Some people really need to get a fucking grip. And 2. There must not be a whole lot of real complaints people are having with the game. I actually struggled with this a bit during the playtest. When I signed up to test an early access indie title, I expected to have to weed out a lot more mistakes than I ended up doing. Sure, there were some bugs and other issues, but most of my feedback was along the lines of, hey, this fight seems a bit too punishing compared to the others, or the music in this area isn't playing correctly. or this texture disappears under certain conditions, but nothing game-breaking or fundamentally wrong with the core design. In fact, my most important piece of feedback was pertaining to Burger Flipper. Oh yeah, I didn't even get to mention that this game has a fully functional in-universe mobile app that you can sink many hours into. It was in fact so addictive that I suggested to the devs to minimize the app when going back into the game so it wouldn't be right there in my face every time I opened my datapad to check my objective. And that's not even the only addictive in-universe game you can play. I also didn't get to talk about how the UI in Selaco is probably the best I've ever seen in this type of game. The animated tooltips are both gorgeous and non-intrusive. The entries into your datapad look slick and are all expertly written. Hell, when's the last time you played an FPS and every single weapon had its own custom crosshair? Then there's the fact that Selaco is, to my knowledge, the first game running on GZ Doom that supports Steam achievements. And these achievements are actually granted for doing cool stuff in the game, like blowing up a toilet or saving a teddy bear, and not for boring stuff like booting up the game for the first time. Or let's talk about how this game has fully functional pool and air hockey tables, which in itself might not seem impressive, if not for the fact that GZ Doom does not come with a physics engine that'd make this kind of stuff a piece of cake. What about how damn satisfying the movement is? It's slower than the true old school shooters, sure, but can you do Liu Kang style flying kicks across an entire room in other shooters? I thought not. Or how you can customize your experience to the point where you can choose between a classic f.e.a.r style zoom in mode and more modern aiming down sights. And if that ain't enough, you can customize much more through Steam Workshop mods. This game has Steam Workshop support, by the way, another GZ Doom first. So odds are that if that purple blood really offends you, you probably won't have to wait too long for a red blood mod to appear, even if it kinda ruins the environmental storytelling. Or we could talk about how Selaco's bonus level, Starlight, is an expertly crafted behemoth that can take you around 2 hours to complete. Or what about the excellent voice work, from the Doom 3 inspired AOS announcements to the f.e.a.r inspired enemy communication and Johnny's absolutely bonkers taunts as the fearsome Juggernaut enemy. Or how... yeah, I could go on and on. But the point is that there is not a single aspect of this game that the developers did not think about extensively. And in every one of those cases, the developers were trying to find the right balance between their own vision, player enjoyment, and the technical possibilities and limitations of their engine. This has led to one of the most user-positive video game experiences I've had like ever. Perhaps that's the true downside of Selaco. Once you've really wrapped your head around the amount of passion, talent and pure hard work poured into this game and its design, it's pretty easy to get disillusioned by other games. I remember playing f.e.a.r 3 during the playtest period, shooting a box of bananas expecting it to explode into a yellow mist, and nothing happened. And sure, not every game needs the attention to detail that Selaco has. If a game like Supplies had all this interactivity, it would probably detract from the entire experience rather than contribute towards it. But damn, is it cool to see how a project of this scope can come out of an indie studio. You know how there's all these videos with titles like "This indie game puts AAA titles to shame"? Well, Selaco is that game, no ifs or buts. As I said in the beginning, Chapter 1 of Selaco is, in my view, the best FPS campaign in years. Familiarity with its influences does elevate my appreciation of this game, but I do not believe that it is a requirement to enjoy it, even if it is your very first single-player FPS. The team behind Selaco has a deep understanding of first-person shooter design, and they have employed this knowledge to cherry-pick the best parts of some of the most legendary titles the genre has seen. Add to that a bunch of fresh, creative ideas and a superb execution of the entire project, and you have got a game that oozes with quality. It is tempting for me to call Selaco a accumulation of 30 years of FPS history, but I do need to stress that the game is still very much its own thing. In any case, as a lifelong fan of the genre, it was a real treat to see a project like this come to life. Whether you're a veteran FPS player yourself or a total newcomer to the genre, I highly encourage you to give this game a try for yourself. There are various difficulty settings and other modifiers, so you'll be able to tweak the game to your liking and immerse yourself into the wonderful new world that is Selaco.